The wind didn't just blow in the high Nevada desert. It bit. It had teeth made of ice and a hunger that could strip the spirit right out of a man's chest. Silas Thorne knew that hunger well. He had lived with it for 15 years. Tucked away in a cabin that sat on the edge of nowhere, built from timber that was as gray and weathered as his own beard. Silas was 54 years old. His hands were mapped with scars, some from ropes, some from knives, and one from a bullet that still throbbed when the pressure dropped. He didn't want much from the world. He wanted the silence of the pines. He wanted the steady breath of his horse. And he wanted to forget the man he used to be when he carried a tin star and a heavy conscience. If this story is sitting with you, hit that like button and subscribe. We have many more trails to ride together. Let's continue. But the West has a way of finding you, even when you've buried your tracks. That morning, Silas was out checking the perimeter fence. The sky was the color of a bruised plum. A storm was coming. He saw it first in the behavior of the birds. A single black crow circling a patch of scrub oak, screaming at something the snow hadn't quite covered yet. Silas dismounted. His knees popped like dry kindling. He pulled his Winchester from the scabbard, not because he expected trouble, but because out here, expecting it was the only reason he was still breathing. He found her face down in the dirt. She looked like a rag doll tossed aside by a cruel child. Her coat was thin, threadbare, and soaked through with a freezing rain that was turning into sleet. Her boots were gone. Her feet were wrapped in bloody strips of burlap. Silas didn't move at first. He stood there, the wind whipping his duster around his leg. He knelt beside her. He didn't ask if she was okay. That was a city question. Instead, he reached out a gloved hand and touched her neck. Her skin was like marble, white and dangerously cold. "Dying's easy out here, girl," Silas muttered, his voice sounding like gravel being turned in a bucket. "Staying alive, that's the work." He picked her up. She was light, too light, the kind of light that comes from a week of running and a lifetime of wanting. He slung her across his saddle and led the horse back toward the cabin. The first flakes of the storm beginning to blur the world into a wall of white. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of dried sage and old wood smoke. Silas worked with the practiced efficiency of a man who had mended broken things his whole life. He built the fire until the cast iron stove began to glow a dull, angry orange. He boiled water. He tore up an old linen shirt to make fresh bandages for those ruined feet. He laid her on the cot by the hearth. For 3 hours, she didn't move. She just drifted in that gray space between the frost and the flame. Silas sat at the heavy oak table, sharpening his skinning knife. The shink, shink, shink of the whetstone was the only heartbeat the room had. He watched her. Her hair was matted with burrs and dry blood. Her face was young, maybe 20, but the lines around her eyes suggested she'd seen the kind of things that usually turn a person's hair white. Outside, the storm hit with full force. The timber of the cabin groaned. The wind howled through the eaves like a pack of starving wolves. Silas liked the sound. It meant no one was coming. Not tonight. Around midnight, she began to stir. Her head thrashed against the pillow. Her breath came in short, jagged gasps. "It's too much," she whispered. Her voice was thin, papery. Silas stood up. He walked over and placed a cool damp cloth on her forehead. "Easy now. You're in the heat of the thaw. It hurts before it gets better." She gripped his wrist. Her fingers were small, but her grip was desperate. Her eyes snapped open. They were a piercing, haunted blue, the color of a deep lake just before it freezes over. She looked at Silas, but she didn't see him. She saw whatever was chasing her through her dreams. "It's getting hot," she panted. Her face was flushed now, a fever red that replaced the marble white. "Silas, it's burning. It's getting so hot in here." Silas frowned. The cabin was warm, but not sweltering. He reached for the water tin, but she was already moving. With trembling, clumsy fingers, she reached for the high collar of her dress. "I can't breathe," she gasped. "The fire, it's right on me." Before Silas could stop her, she unbuttoned the top 3 buttons of her collar and pulled the fabric aside, desperate for the air. Silas froze. The water tin slipped from his hand, splashing against the floorboards. There, just above her collarbone, was a mark, It wasn't a birthmark. It wasn't a scar from an accident. It was a brand. A twisted blackened rose wrapped in barbed wire. The skin around it was puckered and angry. A permanent signature of ownership. Silas knew that mark. He had seen it on the hips of stolen cattle and on the gateposts of burned-out homesteads. It was a brand of the Iron Rose, a gang of regulators turned outlaws who ran the territory with a level of cruelty that made the devil look like a saint. He had spent 3 years of his life trying to put their leader, Miller, in a pine box. He thought he had succeeded. He thought the Iron Rose had been withered by the law. He was wrong. Silas stepped back. His stomach did a slow, sick roll. He looked at the girl. Clara, she would later tell him her name was. And he didn't see a victim anymore. He saw a ticking clock. If she bore that brand, it meant she belonged to Miller. And Miller didn't lose property. Miller didn't let things go. He walked to the window and pushed aside the heavy pelt that served as a curtain. The snow was stacking up, but he knew Miller's trackers. They were men who could find a ghost in a blizzard. He looked back at Clara. She had fallen back into a heavy, feverish sleep, her collar still open, the branded rose staring at him like an unblinking eye. Silas sat back down at the table. He didn't pick up the knife. He picked up his revolver. He opened the cylinder. 6 rounds. Cold. Heavy. Certain. He thought about the peace he had built here. The 15 years of quiet. The way he could finally sleep without seeing the faces of the men he killed. He could put her back outside. He could wrap her in a blanket, leave her on the porch, and pretend he never saw the mark. The storm would take care of the rest. He would have his silence back. But Silas Thorne looked at his own hands. They were the hands of a man who had walked away once before. In a town called Blackwood, 20 years ago, he had walked away from a plea for help, and he had heard the screams in his sleep every night since. Not this time, he whispered to the shadows. The next 3 days were a slow dance of survival. Clara's fever broke on the second night. She woke up screaming, her hands clawing at the air. Silas was there. He didn't touch her. He knew better than to grab a trapped animal. He just sat in a chair, silhouetted by the dying fire, and spoke in a low, steady rumble until her heart slowed down. "You're at the Thorne Ranch," he said. "The door is barred. The stove is full. You're safe." She sat up, clutching the wool blanket to her chest. She saw the buttons on her collar. She saw his eyes. She knew he had seen it. "You know who I am," she said. It wasn't a question. "I know whose mark that is," Silas corrected. "But out here, the only thing a man or woman belongs to is the dirt beneath their feet. And right now this dirt is mine." She didn't thank him. She just looked at the fire. "They'll come. Miller, he says I'm his good luck charm. He says as long as I'm in the camp, the law can't touch him. When I ran, he told me he'd peel the skin off anyone who gave me a cup of water." Silas stood up and walked to the stove. He poured a cup of coffee, bitter black and hot enough to scald. He set it on the table in front of her. "I've always liked my coffee with a bit of trouble," he said. Over the next few days, they spoke little. Silas went about his chores. He chopped wood. He reinforced the shutters. He cleaned his rifle 3 times a day. Clara began to help. She was weak, but she was stubborn. She peeled potatoes. She mended a tear in Silas's duster. There was a rhythm to it, a quiet, domestic piece that felt like a lie, but a beautiful one. Silas found himself watching her when she wasn't looking. The way she stared out the window at the receding snow. The way she flinched at the sound of the wind, yet never stopped working. She was fixing him, and he was fixing her, and neither of them wanted to admit that the world was still turning outside that cabin. We're going to take a breath here, just as the air in that cabin began to grow heavy with the coming storm. If you ever felt like the past was a shadow you couldn't outrun, Silas Thorne knows exactly how you feel. Before we see what happens when the Iron Rose comes to claim his property, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from today? Tell me the time and the place in the comments. I love reading how far these stories travel. And tell me this. If you found a stranger with a mark like that on your doorstep, would you open the door, or would you keep it locked? You don't want to be left behind in the dust. Now, pour yourself a fresh cup of coffee. The wind is picking up, and Silas can hear the sound of hooves on the ridge. The snow began to melt on the fourth day. That was the danger. Silas was out by the barn when he heard it. It wasn't a loud sound, just a rhythmic clack of stone against a loose shoe, coming from the north trail. He didn't panic. He walked into the cabin, closed the door, and dropped the heavy oak bar into place. Clara was standing by the table, a half-mended shirt in her hands. She saw his face, and the shirt fell to the floor. "They're here," she whispered. "Get in the cellar," Silas said. His voice was flat. No emotion, just a business of war. "Silas, you can't." "Cellar. Now." He watched her disappear beneath the floorboards. He pulled the rug over the trapdoor and moved the heavy oak table on top of it. Then he took his position at the window. 4 riders. They weren't dressed like cowboys. They wore long black coats that looked like funeral shrouds. Their horses were well-fed, powerful. In the lead was a man Silas hadn't seen in 15 years, but he'd know that silhouette in hell. Miller. He was thinner than Silas remembered. His face was a map of cruelty, his eyes sunken and yellowed like old parchment. He didn't stop at the gate. He rode right into the yard, his men fanning out in a semicircle. Thorne. Miller's voice carried through the logs. It was a high, wheezing sound like a broken bellows. "I know you're in there, Silas. I smelled the cowardice from 3 miles back." Silas didn't answer. He checked the sight on his Winchester. "You got something of mine," Miller continued. He began to circle his horse. A little bird flew away from the cage. I followed the trail. "It leads right to your door. Now, I always liked you, Silas. You were a damn good lawman back in the day. Too good for this world. So I'm going to give you a choice." Miller stopped his horse directly in front of the door. "Bring her out. Tie her to the back of my saddle. And I'll let you go back to your dirt and your silence. If you don't, well, I've got 3 gallons of kerosene and a very short temper." Silas took a deep breath. He thought about the 15 years of peace. He thought about the girl under the floorboards. He stood up and opened the small firing port he had cut into the shutter. "Miller," Silas called out. The riders went still. Hands drifted toward holsters. "You remember Blackwood?" Silas asked. Miller chuckled. "I remember the fire. I remember the way you ran." "I didn't run," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave. "I waited. I've been waiting for 15 years to finish what we started in that town. And Miller? The girl stays. You leave, or you stay here forever, 6 feet deep." Miller's smile vanished. "Kill him. Burn it all." The first shot shattered the window glass, spraying Silas with shards. He didn't flinch. He squeezed the trigger of the Winchester. The rider to Miller's left spun out of his saddle, a hole the size of a silver dollar in his chest. Chaos erupted. Silas moved with fluidity that belied his age. He wasn't Silas the rancher anymore. He was Silas the regulator. He fired, levered, and fired again. The cabin filled with the acrid, choking smell of blue smoke. Bullets chewed into the log walls. Dust and splinters filled the air. Silas felt a hot iron sear across his shoulder, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He saw Miller diving for cover behind the water trough. "Come on, you bastard." Silas roared. He dropped the rifle. It was empty. He pulled his Colt. He didn't wait for them to come to him. He kicked the bar off the door and swung it open. The sudden move caught them off guard. One rider was trying to light a torch. Silas put 2 rounds in his belly before the man could drop the match. The third rider fired, the bullet grazing Silas's thigh. Silas stumbled, went to one knee, and fired back. The rider's horse reared, throwing him. Before the man could find his feet, Silas ended it. Then there was silence. Only the sound of the wind and the heavy breathing of the horses remained. Silas stood up, his leg leaking blood into the snow. He looked at the water trough. "Miller, out! Now!" Miller rose slowly. His hat was gone. His yellow eyes were wide with a mix of shock and fury. He held a nickel-plated Smith & Wesson, but his hand was shaking. "You're a ghost, Silas," Miller spat. "You're a dead man walking." "Maybe," Silas said, "but I'm walking. You're just standing there." Miller leveled his pistol. Silas didn't wait. He didn't aim for the heart. He didn't aim for the head. He aimed for the man's soul. One shot. Miller fell back against the trough. He looked down at the red blossoms spreading across his white shirt. He looked at Silas, tried to say something, but all that came out was a red mist. He slumped over, his face in the dirty snow. The iron rose was finally dead. Silas didn't move for a long time. He stood in the yard, the smoke from his pistol curling up into the freezing air. He felt the cold now. He felt the pain in his shoulder and his leg. He heard a sound behind him. The cabin door creaked open. Clara stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide. She looked at Silas. She saw the blood on his duster. She saw the look in his eyes, the look of a man who had just invited the devil back into his house and sent him packing. She walked out into the yard. She didn't say thank you. She walked up to Silas and put her shoulder under his arm, steadying him. "You're hit," she said. "I've been hit worse," Silas muttered. Together, they walked back into the cabin. The next few weeks were quiet. The bodies were buried in the scrub oak, marked by nothing but the wind. Silas's wounds healed, leaving new maps of silver on his skin. But something had changed. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was light. One evening, Silas sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the mountains. Clara came out and sat on the steps beside him. She had a bowl of stew in her hands. She had pinned her collar high, covering the brand, but Silas knew it was there, and for the first time, he didn't care. "What will you do now?" Silas asked. Clara looked out at the horizon. "I think I'll stay. If you'll have me. I've spent my whole life being property. Silas, I'd like to see what it's like to be a neighbor." Silas nodded. He looked at his hands, the hands that had killed, and the hands that had mended. "The West is a big place," Silas said. "There's plenty of room for neighbors." Silas Thorne found his peace, but it wasn't the peace of the grave. It was the peace of the